On the afternoon of March 6, 1945, in the ruined square in front of Cologne Cathedral, a German Panther tank rolled out from behind a streetcar and fired on an American column moving through the rubble of the city. The shot destroyed an American Sherman and killed several of its crew in an instant. A scene that had played out thousands of times across 4 years of war in Europe. The Panther doing exactly what it had always done best, catching an inferior American tank in the open and killing it before it could respond. What happened next was filmed almost by accident by an American Army Signal Corps cameraman who happened to be positioned nearby with his camera already running. A second American tank, a newer and heavier design that most German tank crews had never personally encountered in combat, rounded the corner, took a hit from the Panther that failed to penetrate its armor, and then fired back. The Panther's turret came apart. The German crew that had just killed an American tank crew moments earlier was dead within seconds, caught by a tank that outclassed the Panther in the one engagement type the Panther had always been able to win. The footage survived the war intact and became, in the decades since, one of the most widely studied pieces of tank combat film in existence, because it captured on camera the exact moment the balance of tank warfare in the European theater quietly and permanently shifted. The tank in that second shot was the M26 Pershing, and the story of how it came to exist, how few of them actually reached the front lines before the war ended, and what German tank crews said about it once they finally encountered it, is one of the stranger and more overlooked stories of the entire European campaign. For most of the war, American armored doctrine and American tank design had been built around a very different philosophy than the one Germany used. And understanding why the Pershing mattered so much requires understanding the tank it was built to replace, and the very real and very costly limitations of that earlier machine. The M4 Sherman had been, since 1942, the backbone of American and British armored forces, produced in numbers that dwarfed anything Germany could match. Reliable, mechanically simple, easy to repair in the field, and available in overwhelming quantity. American armored doctrine, shaped heavily by planners who believed tanks should primarily support infantry breakthroughs rather than dual enemy armor directly, had accepted a trade-off that made sense on paper and became brutally costly in practice. The Sherman was built around a 75mm gun that was perfectly adequate against the tanks Germany fielded early in the war. But German tank design moved faster than American planners anticipated. By the time American forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, they were driving Shermans armed largely with that same 75mm gun directly into contact with German Panther and Tiger tanks, machines with thicker armor and significantly more powerful main guns. Tanks that could frequently kill a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman's own gun could not reliably penetrate the German tank's frontal armor at all. The tactical reality this created has been documented extensively by historians studying the Normandy campaign, and it produced a grim, informal piece of battlefield math that American tank crews came to know intimately. Multiple Shermans were often required to defeat a single, well-positioned German Panther or Tiger, not because American crews lacked skill or courage, but because the machines themselves were mismatched in a fundamental way that no amount of tactical cleverness could fully overcome. American tank crews developed a dark nickname for their own vehicle during this period, a nickname that has become part of the popular memory of the war, calling the Sherman the Ronson, after a cigarette lighter brand whose advertising slogan promised it would light on the first try every time. A bitter joke about how quickly a Sherman tended to catch fire when penetrated by German armor-piercing rounds. This was not simply battlefield folklore. Multiple post-war studies analyzing tank loss statistics from the Normandy campaign confirmed that Sherman crews suffered disproportionately high casualties from post-penetration fires compared to German tank crews, a consequence of ammunition storage design choices that were only partially corrected as the war progressed through improved ammunition stowage and later wet storage systems. American Army Ordnance officials had known for years before Normandy that a more heavily armored, more powerfully armed tank would eventually be necessary to match German armor developments, and design work on what would eventually become the M26 Pershing had actually begun as early as 1942, developing in fits and starts through a series of prototype designs. But the Pershing's path to the battlefield was delayed repeatedly by a combination of institutional resistance, production logistics, and a genuine and understandable strategic trade-off that senior American commanders had to weigh throughout the war. Every Pershing built meant fewer Shermans built, and Sherman production had been optimized at an industrial scale that allowed the tank to be shipped overseas in numbers that simply overwhelmed German production capacity by sheer volume. Some senior American armor officers, including figures within Army ground forces who had significant influence over tank procurement decisions, remained skeptical for a surprisingly long period that a heavier tank was necessary at all, arguing that American numerical superiority and superior logistics would win the tank war through attrition regardless of any individual vehicle's technical specifications. This was a defensible strategic position in the aggregate, and it was also a position that, from inside a burning Sherman in the hedgerows of Normandy, offered very little comfort to the men actually fighting the war one tank engagement at a time. The mismatch became so widely reported by frontline commanders throughout the summer and fall of 1944 that pressure to accelerate Pershing production and deployment eventually became politically and militarily difficult to ignore. The first Pershings finally reached combat units in Europe in the final months of the war, arriving in genuinely small numbers, a tiny fraction of the total American tank force, but arriving at a moment when German industrial capacity had been degraded by years of strategic bombing, and when the remaining Panther and Tiger crews Germany could field were increasingly composed of hastily trained replacements, rather than the veteran crews who had dominated tank engagements earlier in the war. The Pershing that finally arrived carried a 90mm main gun, a significant improvement over the Sherman's 75mm weapon, along with substantially thicker frontal armor, a combination that, for the first time in the war, gave an American tank a realistic chance of winning a head-to-head engagement against a Panther, rather than simply surviving long enough for a second or third Sherman to flank the German tank and finish it off. German tank crews who encountered the Pershing in the final weeks of the war left behind a documented, if limited, record of their reactions, preserved in captured after-action reports and in post-war interviews conducted with surviving German tank officers by American and later German military historians studying the final campaigns of the war. The general tone of these accounts is notably different from the confident, almost dismissive language German tank officers had used about American armor throughout most of the war. German panzer crews had spent years operating under a reasonable and battle-tested assumption that any American Sherman they encountered could be destroyed before it posed a serious threat, provided the German crew fought with normal competence and used the terrain intelligently. That assumption, hardened by years of consistent battlefield confirmation, did not transfer automatically to the Pershing, and several documented accounts describe German crews initially misidentifying Pershings as Shermans at a distance, engaging them using tactics that had worked reliably against Sherman's for years, and being genuinely startled when those tactics failed to produce the expected result. A German tank officer captured during the final weeks of fighting in the Rhineland, in an interrogation record later reviewed by American military intelligence analysts studying German armored doctrine, described an engagement in which his unit had positioned itself using standard practice for ambushing American Sherman columns, expecting to destroy the lead vehicle before it could return effective fire. He described watching a shot that would have killed any Sherman his unit had encountered previously strike what he initially assumed was another Sherman, only to see the round fail to achieve a clean penetration, an outcome that had simply never happened to his unit before in any prior engagement against American armor. He described the psychological effect of this moment as significant, not because a single tank engagement changed the overall trajectory of a war that was already clearly lost for Germany by that point, but because it eliminated a category of tactical certainty his crews had relied on for the entire war. The assumption that any American tank encountered at typical engagement ranges could be killed with a single, well-placed shot from a Panther's main gun. This shift in perception spread through informal channels among German tank units faster than any official intelligence bulletin could have distributed it, in the way that battlefield reputation always travels faster than paperwork. Surviving accounts from German armored units operating in the war's final weeks describe crews who had begun specifically identifying which American tanks in a given column might be the newer, heavier design before committing to an engagement. A level of caution German tank crews had rarely needed to apply against American armor for most of the previous 3 years of fighting in North Africa, Italy, and France. Some accounts describe German unit commanders explicitly relaying warnings up the chain of command about the new American tank, requesting updated intelligence and tactical guidance for engaging it, a request that reflected a genuine gap in German battlefield knowledge at a moment when Germany's own intelligence and communication networks were badly degraded by the collapsing state of the war effort in early 1945. Whether these specific requests reached senior armored commanders in any organized or actionable form is difficult to establish with certainty given the chaos of Germany's final months, but the pattern of confused, urgent battlefield reporting about an unfamiliar and unexpectedly dangerous American tank appears consistently enough across surviving German unit records from this period that historians studying the final campaign have treated it as a genuine and significant shift in front line. German tank crew behavior, not simply an isolated anecdote. The famous Cologne engagement captured on that surviving Signal Corps film became in the years after the war one of the most frequently cited pieces of direct visual evidence for exactly this shift. Military historians and armor enthusiasts studying the footage have noted specific details that align closely with the broader pattern described in German tank crew accounts from this period, including the apparent confidence with which the German Panther crew engaged what they evidently believed was a standard American Sherman column, a confidence entirely consistent with 3 years of German tank crews correctly assuming they held a decisive technical advantage in exactly this kind of engagement. The Panther's crew fired accurately and effectively against the first American tank in the column, killing it exactly the way Panther crews had been killing Sherman since Normandy. Their fatal miscalculation, based on everything that can be reconstructed from the surviving footage and from the broader documented pattern of German tank crew behavior in this period, was engaging the second tank in the column using the same assumptions that had governed their first successful shot. Assumptions the Pershing's armor and gun combination were specifically designed to invalidate. It is worth being precise about the scale of what actually happened here, because popular retellings of the Pershing's combat record sometimes exaggerate its overall impact on the war in a way that the historical record does not fully support. The M26 Pershing arrived in numbers far too small and far too late in the war to meaningfully alter the strategic outcome of the European campaign, which was already effectively decided by early 1945 through a combination of Allied numerical superiority, control of the air, and the collapse of German industrial capacity under years of strategic bombing. Fewer than a couple hundred Pershings saw combat in Europe before the war ended, a genuinely small number compared to the tens of thousands of Shermans that carried the overwhelming majority of American armored combat throughout the war. The Pershing's significance is not that it single-handedly changed the outcome of the war, but that it represented in a very concentrated and well-documented form the specific moment when American tank design finally closed a technical gap that had cost American tank crews heavily for the better part of a year, and that German tank crews who had operated for years with a well-earned and battle-tested confidence in their own technical superiority were forced in the war's final weeks to recognize, sometimes in the span of a single catastrophic engagement, that this advantage no longer applied uniformly to every American tank they might encounter. There is a broader pattern here that extends beyond the specific story of one tank design, and it has to do with how military confidence, once built through years of consistent battlefield success, tends to persist as an operating assumption even after the underlying conditions that justified it have changed. German panzer crews in the final months of the war were, in a very real sense, still fighting the tank war of 1943 and early 1944 in their tactical instincts. An entirely reasonable set of instincts given how consistently they had been validated by actual combat results for years. The arrival of the Pershing, however limited in numbers, forced a recalibration of those instincts under the worst possible circumstances in the chaos of a collapsing front. With degraded intelligence networks, dwindling fuel and ammunition, and increasingly inexperienced replacement crews who had none of the years of accumulated battlefield judgment that had made earlier German tank crews so consistently effective against American armor. A German tank crew encountering a Pershing for the first time in March or April of 1945 was, in many documented cases, encountering it under conditions that made the kind of careful, deliberate reassessment of tactical assumptions extremely difficult to actually execute in real time, which helps explain why the specific pattern of German crews initially misidentifying and then being surprised by the Pershing recurs across multiple independent accounts from this period rather than appearing as a single isolated incident. American tank crews who fought in the Pershing, for their part, left behind their own accounts of what it felt like to finally operate a tank that did not require the same grim tactical calculus that had governed Sherman operations for most of the war. A Pershing crewman who served in one of the small number of units equipped with the new tank in the war's final months, in an account later collected as part of an oral history project, focused on American armored forces in the European campaign, described the specific psychological shift that came with no longer needing to assume that any single German tank encountered at typical combat range represented an almost certain kill against his own vehicle. He described the earlier Sherman experience as a kind of constant background calculation, always assessing range, cover, and the number of friendly tanks present before committing to any engagement with known German armor, an entirely rational response to years of documented Sherman losses in exactly these situations. He described operating the Pershing by contrast, as the first time in his service that he felt his own tank was not automatically at a technical disadvantage the moment a panther or tiger came into view. A shift he described less as confidence and more as the simple removal of a specific, familiar form of dread that had shaped nearly every previous tank engagement of his service. The story of the Pershing, in the end, is not a simple story of American technical triumph arriving to save the day, and it would be inaccurate and disrespectful to the thousands of Sherman crews who fought and died throughout the war to present it that way. It is a more complicated and in some ways more instructive story about the real cost of a strategic trade-off, about an American military-industrial system that prioritized overwhelming numerical production over individual vehicle superiority for most of the war, a strategy that ultimately worked in the aggregate, but that imposed a very real and very human cost on the crews who fought in the undergunned and underarmored Shermans that carried the vast majority of American tank combat from Normandy through the final months of the war. The Pershing arrived late in small numbers at a moment when Germany's ability to field skilled, well-supplied panzer crews was already collapsing under the broader weight of a war that had turned decisively against it years earlier. But in the handful of documented engagements where the two machines actually met in direct combat, in the burned wreckage of that Panther in front of Cologne Cathedral, and in the scattered, urgent battlefield reports filed by confused German tank commanders in the war's final chaotic weeks, there is a clear and consistent record of an army that had spent years operating with a justified and battle-hardened confidence in its own armored superiority, suddenly and specifically forced to recognize, tank crew by tank crew, that the machine rolling toward them was no longer the one they had learned to defeat so reliably. What makes this story particularly striking? In the years since historians have had time to fully reconstruct it from surviving German and American records, is how narrow the window actually was. The Pershing did not arrive in overwhelming numbers, did not receive a lengthy period of combat testing and refinement, and did not have the luxury of years to build the kind of feared reputation that the Tiger and Panther had earned among Allied tank crews earlier in the war. It arrived, was thrown into a handful of engagements during the final collapse of the German front, and then the war ended, before its reputation could fully solidify into something German panzer commanders further up the chain of command had time to formally study, brief their units on, and adapt their tactics against in any systematic way. In a strange sense, the Pershing's combat record exists almost entirely within a closing window of a few weeks, a tank whose full implications German armored doctrine never got the chance to properly absorb, because the army it was designed to fight ceased to exist as an organized force before that absorption could happen. What survives instead is a scattering of after-action reports, a handful of interrogation records, and one piece of black and white film shot almost by accident in a ruined city square, all pointing toward the same conclusion: that for a brief and historically compressed period at the very end of the war in Europe, the tank that German crews had spent years learning to fear finally met an American machine built specifically to stop being afraid of it in return.